Napoleon fell? A muddy field in Belgium, a final charge, a defeat named Waterloo. It's the ending taught in every textbook, painted on every wall, replayed in every documentary. But here's the uncomfortable truth almost nobody wants to admit. By the time Napoleon reached that field in 1815, he was already a ghost of the man who once ruled Europe. The real decision that destroyed him happened 3 years earlier, in a place no French army should have ever marched: Russia. To understand why this decision was so catastrophic, you need to understand who Napoleon was before he made it. By 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled more of Europe than any single man since the Roman emperors. France, Spain, Italy, huge stretches of Germany, all bent to his will. Even Austria and Prussia, once his fiercest enemies, now called themselves his allies. His armies were the most feared fighting force on the continent. His legend seemed unstoppable. So why would a man at the height of his power risk everything on an invasion that history's greatest military minds would later call insane? He wasn't born into power. He was a minor noble from Corsica, mocked for years by the aristocrats around him. He rose through the chaos of the French Revolution on raw battlefield brilliance alone, eventually crowning himself emperor in 1804. Every step of that rise reinforced one belief inside him: that he was simply better at war than anyone else alive, and that belief kept being proven true again and again for nearly 2 decades. The invasion starts with an economic weapon Napoleon had built to strangle his one remaining true enemy, Britain. He called it the Continental System, a blockade that forbade any European nation under his control from trading with the British. Cut off Britain's markets, collapse its economy, force surrender without a shot fired across the Channel. For years it mostly worked, but one country kept quietly breaking the rules: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had reluctantly joined the blockade after a humiliating defeat, but Russian grain and timber kept flowing toward British ports because that trade kept the Russian economy alive. By 1810, Alexander reopened Russian ports to British ships in all but name. To Napoleon, this wasn't a policy disagreement, it was betrayal. Here's where the story gets interesting, because the decision Napoleon made next wasn't really about punishing Russia. It was about ego, about the belief that had carried him from a minor Corsican noble to the Emperor of France, the belief that he simply could not lose. The historian Andrew Roberts, who spent years combing through Napoleon's personal letters, argues that by 1812, Napoleon had started to believe his own myth. He'd beaten every major army in Europe. Why would Russia be any different? So in June of 1812, Napoleon assembled what was, at the time, the largest army the world had ever seen. Over 600,000 men marching east under one banner, one purpose: force Russia back into line. And this is where the myths usually take over. Most people assume Napoleon lost in Russia because of the brutal winter, but that's not what broke his army first. The historian Dominic Levin, drawing on Russian military archives largely ignored by Western historians, found something far more devastating than snow. The Russians simply refused to fight him. Napoleon's entire genius depended on one thing: drawing the enemy into a decisive battle he could win. But the Russian generals, knowing they couldn't beat him in open battle, simply retreated, again and again, pulling his massive army deeper into Russian territory, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point, burning the crops and villages behind them so there was nothing left for the French to live on. His marshals began to worry. Some quietly urged him to turn back, but retreat wasn't part of Napoleon's vocabulary, and the deeper his army marched, the more the campaign became a matter of pride rather than strategy. By the time the two armies finally clashed at Borodino in September, both sides had already bled so heavily that the victory barely mattered. Napoleon captured Moscow days later, but the city was already burning, deliberately set alight rather than let him winter comfortably inside it. There was no surrender waiting, no Tsar begging for peace, just ash, silence, and a Russian army still very much alive. This is the moment the decision truly collapsed. Napoleon sat in a burned, empty city for over a month, waiting for a peace offer that was never coming, because Alexander had realized something Napoleon hadn't. He didn't need to beat the French emperor in battle. He just needed to outlast him. By the time Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, it was already too late. The historian Adam Zamoyski, reconstructing the march from first-hand soldier accounts, describes an army that had already destroyed itself through starvation and disorganization before the real cold even arrived. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers abandoned cannons they no longer had the strength to pull. Then came the winter. Soldiers froze to death standing upright. Rivers cracked under the weight of retreating troops. Cossack cavalry harassed the column relentlessly. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia that summer, fewer than 100,000 marched back out. That number matters more than any battle Napoleon ever lost. Not a defeat on the field, but the near-total destruction of the greatest army Europe had ever assembled, gone not primarily to Russian bullets, but to hunger, exposure, and a humiliation Napoleon never saw coming. And here's the part that connects everything together. The reason this decision, not Waterloo, actually destroyed him. Napoleon's empire had been held together by fear and momentum, the belief across Europe that his armies were unbeatable. The moment that myth shattered in the Russian snow, every nation he'd conquered began quietly preparing to turn against him. Prussia switched sides within months. Austria followed. The coalition that would eventually defeat him at Leipzig and finally at Waterloo 2 years later wasn't built on a single battlefield victory. It was built on the wreckage of the Russian campaign, on the moment the world realized Napoleon could bleed like everyone else. Waterloo didn't destroy Napoleon, it simply finished what Russia started. So why does this matter today, 2 centuries later? Because the pattern Napoleon fell into is one of the oldest traps in human history, and it's not unique to emperors. Overwhelming success convinces powerful people that the rules governing everyone else no longer apply to them. Napoleon didn't lose because his army was weak. He lost because his own confidence blinded him to a threat that couldn't be defeated the way he was used to winning, an enemy who refused to play by his rules, who traded space for time, who understood that outlasting an opponent can be more powerful than outfighting one. You see the same pattern outside of warfare entirely. Businesses that dominate their markets for decades then collapse almost overnight because leadership assumed old strategies would work forever. Napoleon's Russian campaign wasn't a failure of courage or skill. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that an enemy might refuse to fight him on his own terms at all. Empires rise on ambition. They tend to fall on the same thing. The city burned. The empire eventually crumbled. But that Corsican boy's most dangerous belief, the one that whispers to every person who's ever won too many times in a row that they're somehow untouchable, never really disappeared at all.